One of the most common questions I get from secular folk or atheists, or just non-Christians in general, whether they be on the left or the right or what have you, is, okay, so I buy into this abstract notion of God that you're giving me, um, but why should that convince me of Christianity? I could just as well be a Muslim or a Jew or just a classical theist. How would you bridge that gap between the God of classical theism that you argue for in your videos and the God of Christianity? Well, I think it's very important to address this for a variety of reasons. First, just because intellectually, I think it's important to rationally justify my own beliefs, religious or philosophical or political. I also think it's important for Christians to have a solid answer to this question in their own encounters. We need a way to explain Christ to people that is out of the same train of thought that we use to explain God's existence to people. It has to be metaphysical. And I'm sure that for many of you who are subscribed to me, this would come to no shock to you that I would say this. At the end of the day, we need a way in which when we mention the God of classical theism, the God of pure actuality, unconditioned being itself, subsistent existence itself, the unconditioned good, etc., that Christianity can naturally flow from those concepts and their mental associations. It shouldn't be like some arbitrary afterthought that just tends to go together with them. It has to have a natural coherence and a natural logical flow to it. And that's what I really want to do in this video and my channel as a whole. So how do we get there? Well, I think there's an argument that really does seem to establish the rational plausibility of this doctrine from what you can already prove from reason about the existence of God and his nature. So in laying that out, this video is definitely going to presuppose that those arguments hold up. So make sure you watch my video on the existence of God if you absolutely want to have a solid basis for what I'm going to say in this video. And I will link that in the description. But before we get into the argument, I think it's important to briefly recap a bit. Not so much on the arguments that get you to God's existence, but on certain things about the God of classical theism that I'm going to argue naturally lead to the central doctrine of Christianity. And I think that is, without a doubt, the incarnation, right? The idea that God becomes man in the person of Christ. That is the firm foundation. That is the central foundation of Christianity, and that is what makes it distinctive above all the other religions. And so I think if you can establish that kind of from reason, and show that that is rationally plausible by itself, then I think you've opened up a very natural route from classical theism to Christianity. So the first thing I want to say about classical theism is that God, on this view, and as I prove in my video on the existence of God, is the pure and subsistent act of existence itself. He has pure actuality. He is not a being among other beings that just happens to exist or share existence derivatively. According to St. Thomas, and as I prove in the video on the existence of God, there is no distinction between God's essence and his existence, which is to say, God is none other than the pure, subsistent act of existence itself, pure actuality. This will be crucial to the argument. The second thing I want to say about classical theism is that God is infinite. And this is proved by the fact that to conceive of a limit is necessarily to limit actuality to a restrictive or particular mode of being. This is the essence of what it means to be finite. One's being restricted to a particularized mode of contingent existence. And if all such restrictive limits were erased, one would inevitably just be left with pure actuality. Pure, unconditioned being itself. Period. Full stop. Adding anything onto that would be a limit on being because it would amount to being in a certain respect. This limits the mode of existence to a restrictive scope of being, and hence it follows that the only being that could be unlimited in every respect is that which simply is, with no restrictive modes of being that would follow upon an act of existence. A dog, for example, is limited precisely because it exists as a dog. A human is limited because a human exists as a human. The quantum vacuum is limited precisely because it exists as the quantum vacuum. These things are restricted to their quiddity, their essence, their form, and thus they cannot even conceivably be said to be infinite. Thus, the Thomistic thesis, actuality is only limited by potency or potentiality. Restrictive natures are in potency or potentiality, by which I mean incomplete being, with respect to their active existence, which gives the reality in question completeness and determination and real being. But once the active existence is conjoined to a restrictive essence, that puts a definitional limit on that active existence, which is to the essence as act is to potency. What I just said is a lot more understandable if you watch my video on the existence of God, where I just explain the distinction between actuality and potentiality and whatnot. But from that video, the conclusion is that pure actuality is unlimited and infinite. The third thing that I want to say about classical theism is that God is pure goodness, the essence of goodness itself. And this can be proved rather easily by reflecting on the metaphysics of the good. I'm going to make the argument that goodness and being are convertible. That is to say, goodness is ultimately the same as being, or actuality. There is an inseparable relation between the two, such that in reality, goodness and being are really ontologically identical. Goodness is simply actuality as sought after by rational will or inclined toward by a thing's tendency to conform to its nature, as a tree tends toward the intake of nutrients and its own growth. It's easy to see how goodness and actuality are linked or intrinsically related. For whenever we speak of something being good or having the quality of goodness, we invariably mean that the thing has been perfected in some way. A thing has received a perfection of some sort, no matter how insignificant or inanimate. Now, perfection is itself unintelligible without reference to actuality. For example, a heart is more or less perfect to the degree to which it performs its proper function precisely as a heart. A triangle is more or less perfect to the degree that it conforms to its geometrical definition. A tree is more perfect to the extent that it performs its tree-like functions properly according to the mode of its nature as a tree. So we can see that perfection is really ultimately sourced in a thing's actuality, being what it is, participating in actuality. The last thing we have to establish before we move forward with the actual argument is that goodness is something self-communicative or self-diffusive. In other words, goodness is such that it is necessarily active, and through its activity produces its own like. That is to say, there is something about the nature of goodness itself, that is to say, actuality ultimately, and which is ultimately to say God's essence, that has a tendency to share itself, to diffuse its own goodness, either to itself or beyond itself. Now, of course, in nature we can find a lot of examples of this. Anything that is by nature good is such that it has a tendency to draw things to itself to share in its own goodness. I mean, food is like that, human sexuality is like that. I mean, it has a tendency to draw to itself those things that are drawn to it by their nature. But most fundamentally, we can establish this principle the best way by drawing logical implications from our understanding of God as the source of goodness itself, from what we know about God from reason, as was proved in my video on the existence of God. But first, the reason this principle is so important and why it's relevant to Christianity is because if we can establish that the essence of goodness is such that it has a tendency to self-communicate or to diffuse itself or to share itself, then we would ultimately have to apply that to God's relation to the world. And if we can apply that to God's relation to the world, then we can see how that could be used as a premise in the argument that God would unite himself to a creature so as to communicate his goodness himself to that creature in a full and complete way. And how we're going to get there will be showed by the following steps. We already have established that goodness is fundamentally grounded in actuality. And actuality is fundamentally grounded in God's essence, which is pure actuality itself. This is one of the ways in which we can prove that goodness is of itself active, which we would have to know before we can prove that it's self-diffusive or self-communicative. For goodness in and of itself, in its unconditioned purity, is one and the same with God's essence. And given the fact that we exist as a result of God's active creation, we know simply by virtue of that fact alone that God himself is active, because he created the world. And since God is absolutely simple, from what that is to say, lacking without any parts, either constitutive, metaphysical, physical, whatever, and I prove that in my video on the existence of God, it follows that pure actuality is necessarily active, and hence goodness is also necessarily active of itself. So you can see how this argument starts with the premise that God exists as pure actuality, derived from other arguments that I've gone into, and that since God created the world, then he is necessarily active, and since he is necessarily active given divine simplicity, it proves that pure actuality itself is necessarily active, and hence, since goodness is ultimately grounded in actuality, it would follow, therefore, that goodness, as such, is necessarily active. And it is active in such a way that it is also relational and self-communicative. And this is where it will bear relevance to the video, as I said. If God is pure goodness itself by virtue of being pure actuality, then the creation of the world would necessarily be an outpouring of his own goodness as an object of his love, as love is none other than to will the good of another. So to quickly recap on that, since God himself is goodness, then any outpouring of goodness on part of the divine would necessarily be an outpouring of himself, since his essence is goodness itself. And this is how we can know that goodness is necessarily self-diffusive. Now, of course, this is not to say that the creation of the world is some kind of necessity on the part of God, for since he is existentially self-sufficient in every respect, there is nothing to impose him to create, and yet he is essentially self-diffusive, self-communicative. Christianity, I think, answers this question beautifully in my judgment, kind of as a brief aside, through its doctrine of the Trinity. This essential self-diffusion, or self-communication, or sharing of God's goodness within his own essence, or nature, is fulfilled, as the Thomistic theologian Garrigou-Lagrange put it, through the Father generating the Son, communicating to him not only a participation in his nature, his intellect, and his love, but his complete and indivisible nature, so that the Son of God is light of light, God of God, true God of true God. End quote. And the aforementioned divine love proceeding from the internal act of divine self-communication is, due to divine simplicity, also fully God, and this is referred to as the Holy Spirit. But what about beyond the divine essence? So we know, just to again recap a bit, we know that God is not compelled to create, and yet, given the fact of creation, we know that he is self-communicative, or has a tendency to share himself or diffuse himself. Thus, the core of his being is on some level to communicate himself the highest good. That this is fulfilled perfectly and completely within his own essence first tells us something profound and revealing. It tells us that goodness is self-diffusive in such a way that the nobler or higher the good, the more fully and intimately it is self-diffusive or self-communicative. This is because God is the highest good, as the essence of goodness itself, and since we know by the creation of the world that he is self-diffusive, we know that it is of the essence of God to pour out his goodness. But since we know that God did not create the world out of necessity, this must be fulfilled first within his own essence, communicating himself utterly and completely in the Trinity, and for that reason we can say that as the standard of goodness itself, and therefore the highest or the noblest, the nobler or higher a good, the more it will diffuse itself fully and intimately by virtue of its participation in the divine good, which acts in just this way. This is easily verified in experience. The sun illuminates and heats, fire generates fire, plant produces plant, animal generates animal, man begets man, the artist produces art, the scientist discovers truths according to his own skill, teachers impart knowledge, etc. We can see this metaphysical abstract principle confirmed in daily experience all the time. So it shouldn't be controversial just because it takes a lot of abstract metaphysical demonstration to establish it from the ground up. So now that we have established A, that God is the essence of goodness by virtue of being pure actuality, B, goodness is self-diffusive or self-communicative or has a tendency to share itself, and C, the higher or nobler the good, the more fully and intimately it will diffuse or communicate or share itself, and D, God's creation of the world is a result of the outpouring of himself beyond his own essence. What can we synthesize from this? Well, as St. Thomas Aquinas says, I think we can say this much. Quote, that it belongs to the essence of the highest good to communicate itself in the highest manner to the creature. And this is brought about chiefly by his so joining created nature to himself that one person is made up of these three, the Word, a soul, and flesh, as Augustine says. Hence it is manifest that it was fitting that God should become incarnate, unquote. So let's unpack that a bit. What is man? What is humanity? Of course, on the Aristotelian view, and on the Aristotelian definition, he is a rational animal. But I think there's something more fundamental to what man is than that. And many have been perceptive of this throughout the centuries. Church fathers, theologians, philosophers of old, even well beyond the walls of Christianity, really. That man is really a compendium, a summation, or a microcosm of the whole universe in one substance. All hierarchies of being are existent or inhere within him. For one, there is corporeality or minerality. That is to say, we are composed of the basic, non-living chemical elements that permeate the entire physical universe. Secondly, there is in man the principle of life, and all levels of it too. On the most basic level, we share base level bacterial and vegetative capacities with bacteria and plants. We share the capacity for instinct and higher sensation, as with the animals, as a cat or a dog. And finally, there is in man the intellectual principle that has the capacity to know God himself, truth, and immaterial substances such as universals, or on the Christian view, the angels, which are purely intellectual creatures. And these basic level categories sum up, it seems to me, all hierarchies or levels of created being in one substance, so that man is a microcosm of creation. Thus, if God were to communicate or share himself with creation in a full and intimate way, it would seem to me that the best way for him to do that, whilst keeping the distinction between himself and creation fully intact, would be to take one substance, which incorporates the whole of creation within it, and unite it absolutely to himself in the fullest and most intimate of ways possible. What better way is this expressed than the incarnation of God himself in human flesh, where God, in accord with his self-diffusive nature, outpours his goodness in such a way that he unites himself utterly to his creation through man in Christ. And for that reason, I think the central doctrine of the incarnation is not only defensible, but has rational grounding in its own right. Thus, I think from what I have been arguing, there is a natural progression from classical theism to this central tenet of Christianity, that is the incarnation, that is to say, the coming together of humanity and divinity in this complete way as an extension of God's divine tendency to communicate or diffuse himself, who is the sheer essence of the good, to creation in such a way that is complete and yet doesn't just collapse into pantheism. The world can still be itself, and God is still transcendent as the active, pure being, and yet the divine and the cosmos do meet in one substance, in man and Christ, who sums up the whole of creation through his humanity. Now, this is not a deductive proof, such as those which prove the existence of God and his divine attributes, but it is to show that from classical theism there are logical implications that make this doctrine not just possible, but rationally plausible, given its coherence and congruence with what can be known about God and the world from reason, so that on rational ground, we say that really would be rather odd or improbable to live in a world where the incarnation did not happen at all. But if you look back in history, and we see one historically explosive religion predicated precisely and uniquely on this one premise, and that those who originally propagated it clearly didn't have these metaphysical abstractions in mind, and it went all the way to their deaths to defend it. It really does make the leap from classical theism to Christian theism that much easier. Of course, Christianity does add things that can never be demonstrated by reason alone, and that should make sense if we're talking about divine revelation here. In fact, if you begin with the rational premise of the incarnation, the whole narrative makes sense. Obviously, from our experience, God did not incarnate from the very beginning, and mankind existed long before this would have happened. So if the incarnation were to happen at all, it would make sense for God to have prepared this in some way. Not only that, but it's obvious from our experience that mankind is sinful. He is not in right alignment for union with God. And yet, metaphysically and rationally, we can show that God would have desired this. Christianity accounts for this incongruity with the doctrine of original sin, it seems to me, which, as Chesterton says, is verified just by reading, the morning newspaper. That is, of course, a statement of faith, but it is easily believable when you realize that the world is not perfected as it was intended to be, as one should expect by this rational argument, perhaps. Mankind is supposed to be ordered toward union with God because, as rational animals, we are not only ordered to knowing particular truth with our intellects and attaining particular goods with our wills, but are ordered toward knowing truth and goodness in and of themselves, which subsist in the essence of God, as is proved by classical theism. We know from our experience that A, we encounter an almost natural opposition to God by being weighed down by our irrational passions, and B, we know of no natural mechanism to both overcome this and ascend to union with God on our own, because the finite cannot traverse the infinite. So it makes sense that if God was not only going to unite himself to human nature, but was also going to realign the rest of mankind to participate in union with God, which only he can do, then he would pave a way for this by choosing a vessel for his incarnation and purifying it. And this is really the story of the Old Testament of the Jews. So that when the incarnation does happen, it can be understood from what God has been foreshadowing previously through the Jews. And once the incarnation does happen, divinity and humanity not only come together, but on the Christian understanding, Christ realigns humanity to what it was intended to be, ordered toward union with God. And he does this by entering into the logical extension of human disorder and evil, which is death or non-being, since the essence of evil itself is that it is a privation of being, or a lack of being, a lack of a do-good, and thereby canceling it out via his union with his divinity, culminating in the resurrection. Finally, he establishes a means through which us fallen creatures who cannot ascend to divinity on our own and are weighed down by the force of our irrational passions can latch on to him, the unification of divinity and humanity, and reap the fruits of his redemptive act of his life, death, and resurrection. Christianity fulfills this via its conception of the Church and the sacraments. The Church is Christ's mystical body, and through baptism we are metaphysically and ontologically subsumed into it, and through the Eucharist we physically unite ourselves to the unification of humanity and divinity by incorporating the very body and blood of Christ into our being, and thus we can share and participate in the incarnation. We can be sharers in God's initial desire to diffuse his goodness into creation. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not claiming that all of what I just said can be proved by reason. Original sin, the sacraments, the Church, Jesus Christ specifically, all these are articles of faith. But what I am saying is that this argument builds upon classical theism in such a way that it allows for that natural progression from point A to point B. It shows that if classical theism is true, the incarnation is rationally plausible. And if the incarnation is rationally plausible, then we should look into history and see if there's some kind of indication of this being fulfilled in some way. And we look at Christianity and we see that it was this explosive historical movement ignited by people who weren't doing abstract metaphysics, but they nevertheless bore witness to the very thing that I'm defending here on rational and metaphysical grounds. And they were so devoted to this that they were willing to undergo torturous deaths in defense of their historical testimony of what is essentially the conclusion of this metaphysical abstract argument. Christianity alone fulfills what reason can prefigure and adds a coherent system, in my judgment, that accounts for man's brokenness as well as for a mechanism by which he can participate in this unification of humanity and divinity by incorporating himself into Christ's mystical body through baptism, thereby receiving the grace in order to ascend to union with God and becoming absolutely united to the incarnate God through receiving a concrete share in Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity through the reception of the Eucharist, and preserving oneself in the state of sanctification through the other sacraments unto one's death. So that's the argument. Again, I realized towards the end it got quite theological in the sense that I've overstepped the bounds of pure philosophy. But the point is, one can clearly see the relationship between classical theism and Christianity. Christianity, at least the most fundamental tenet of it, the incarnation, which I have defended on strictly rational grounds, is an extension of what can be known about God from classical theism. And so if you grant classical theism, you have to deal with this question of the incarnation. And if you have to deal with the question of the incarnation, and you come to the conclusion that it actually would be rationally plausible from what can be known from classical theism, then I really don't see how you can't look at Christianity and see that as the perfect fulfillment of what can be established by those rational arguments for A, classical theism, and for B, the essential doctrine of Christianity, that is, the incarnation that I've defended throughout this presentation. So that's the argument. Let me know what you think. Again, I think it is very important that as we defend whether it be classical theism or philosophical conceptions of the divine, if we are serious about defending Christianity, we make a solid effort to link those two together and to ensure that there is an easy pathway from classical theism to at least disposing oneself rationally to seeing how Christianity can really fit coherently and plausibly into that framework. So I hope you liked the video. I hope you thought it was informative. Let me know what you think in the comments. Subscribe if you like the channel. It helps out. And God bless.